My beloved child. Stop scrolling for just a moment, because what you are about to hear is not a story you were meant to rush through. Something has been moving quietly behind the scenes of your life, something connected to a person whose heart has not been as silent as their actions made you believe. And before this message reaches its final moment, you are going to understand why someone who once wondered whether you were still thinking about them made a decision they never expected to make. Pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Because somewhere in this fictional spiritual story, a question was asked about you. Not by a stranger. Not by someone who simply wanted gossip. But by the person your soul once recognized in a way your mind could never fully explain. Your soulmate. They wanted to know one thing. They wanted to know whether you were happy without them. And when the answer came back, something inside them broke. Not because the answer was cruel. Not because the psychic told them that you hated them. Not because someone had replaced them. The answer destroyed them for a completely different reason. You were healing. You were becoming peaceful. You were learning how to live without waiting for them. And the person who had secretly convinced themselves that you would always remain emotionally attached to their absence suddenly realized that the version of you they had left behind no longer existed. That realization came like thunder. But there is something deeper you need to understand before I reveal what the psychic actually saw. Because your soulmate did not contact the psychic on an ordinary day. They contacted them after something happened. Something small. Something that most people would have ignored. A photograph. A message. A memory. A song. A place. Something reminded them of you. And suddenly, all the emotions they had buried underneath pride, distance, silence, and excuses came rushing back. They tried to dismiss it. They told themselves it meant nothing. They told themselves they were simply nostalgic. They told themselves everyone remembers people from their past sometimes. But then they saw something that made them stop. They saw your smile. And there was something different about it. You were not smiling the way you used to smile when you were hoping they would notice. You were not smiling as though you were trying to prove something. You were not smiling through hidden pain. You looked peaceful. That was what frightened them. Because your soulmate remembered the old version of you. The version who waited. The version who wondered. The version who replayed conversations late at night. The version who asked what went wrong. The version who silently hoped that one day they would come back and explain everything. And now, when they looked at you from a distance, they saw someone who seemed to have stepped beyond that chapter. They stared at the image longer than they should have. They zoomed in. They looked at your eyes. They searched for sadness. They searched for loneliness. They searched for any tiny indication that you were still hurting because of them. But they could not find what they wanted to find. And that is when fear entered their heart. Not fear of you. Fear of losing their place in your heart forever. That night, they could not sleep. They turned off the lights. They put their phone down. They tried to distract themselves. But every time their mind became quiet, your face appeared. And eventually, they asked themselves the question they had been avoiding for far too long. Are they really happy without me? The question became heavier. What if they actually moved on? What if they don't miss me anymore? What if someone else makes them happier than I ever did? What if I waited too long? And then another thought arrived. What if they finally became the person I always knew they could become, and I am no longer part of that future? That thought hurt the most. Because your soulmate had once believed that time was on their side. They thought they could disappear and return whenever they wanted. They thought your heart would remain exactly where they had left it. They believed distance would make you miss them. They believed silence would make you wonder about them. They believed that eventually you would reach out. But they did not understand what was happening inside you. While they were watching the clock, you were rebuilding your life. While they were expecting you to remain emotionally available, you were learning emotional independence. While they were imagining your sadness, you were discovering your strength. And while they were wondering whether you still loved them, you were slowly learning that loving someone does not mean abandoning yourself. That was the transformation they never saw coming. And when they finally realized it, they did something unusual. They hired a psychic. Not because they were certain they believed in psychic readings. They told themselves it was simply curiosity. They told themselves they wanted clarity. They told themselves they were asking one harmless question. But deep inside, they already knew what they wanted to hear. They wanted the psychic to say, "They still love you. They are waiting. They are unhappy. They have not moved on. They are secretly hoping you will return." That was the answer they were expecting. That was the answer that would have allowed them to sleep peacefully. Because if you were still unhappy without them, then they could continue believing they still mattered in the same way. If you were still waiting, then they could delay. If you were still emotionally attached, then they could tell themselves there was still time. So they contacted the psychic late at night. Their hands were trembling slightly as they typed your name. They hesitated before sending the message. Then they finally wrote the question. "Is this person happy?" The psychic responded that they could look into the emotional energy surrounding the situation. Your soulmate waited. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt like hours. Then the psychic sent another message. "I see someone who has been through emotional exhaustion." Your soulmate's heart tightened. They thought, "I knew it." They expected the next words to confirm that you were still suffering. But the psychic continued. "They were hurt deeply, but they are not where they used to be." Your soulmate stopped breathing for a moment. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "They are becoming happy again." Your soulmate stared at the screen. They read it once. Then twice. Then again. Becoming happy again. Not pretending. Not distracting themselves. Not hiding their pain. Becoming happy. The psychic described an emotional shift. They said your energy appeared calmer. They said you had stopped chasing an answer. They said you had begun releasing something you once desperately wanted to hold on to. And your soulmate suddenly understood what that meant. You had released them. Maybe not completely. Maybe not perfectly. But enough. Enough that their absence no longer controlled your emotional world. Enough that your mornings were no longer built around whether they would contact you. Enough that your nights were no longer consumed by wondering where they were. Enough that you could remember them without losing yourself. That realization hit your soulmate harder than any accusation ever could. Because they had secretly imagined that you would always be there. And now they were discovering that love can survive distance while attachment cannot. They asked the psychic another question. "Do they still think about me?" The psychic paused. Then answered. "Yes." Your soulmate felt relief. But the relief lasted only seconds. Because the next sentence was even more devastating. "They think about you differently now." Your soulmate read that sentence again. Differently? What did that mean? The psychic explained that you no longer seemed to think about them from a place of desperation. You remembered the connection. You remembered the good moments. You remembered the pain. But you were beginning to see the entire story instead of only the part you wished had been different. And that meant something important. You were no longer idealizing them. You were seeing them clearly. That terrified them. Because when someone loves you while idealizing you, they may forgive what they cannot understand. But when someone heals enough to see you clearly, they begin asking different questions. Not, "Why did you leave?" But, "Why did you treat me that way?" Not, "Will you come back?" But, "If you came back, would anything actually change?" Not, do you love me? But, can your love become consistent? Those questions were waiting somewhere inside you. And your soulmate sensed it. They suddenly realized that returning to you would not be as simple as sending a message. They could not simply say, I miss you. Because you had learned to ask what happens after, I miss you. They could not simply say, I made a mistake. Because you had learned to ask what they were going to do differently. They could not simply say, I still love you. Because you had learned that love without action can become another form of pain. This was the beginning of their emotional collapse. Not because you had rejected them. You had not. Not because someone else had taken their place. The psychic did not see another person standing between you. What the psychic saw was something much more powerful. They saw you standing between your old self and your new self. And your old self was no longer willing to sacrifice everything for love. Your soulmate asked, are they completely over me? The psychic answered carefully. No. Your soulmate exhaled. Then came the second sentence. But they are becoming okay with the possibility that they may never have you. Silence. That sentence destroyed something inside them. Because there is a huge difference between losing someone and realizing that someone is learning to live with losing you. The first can feel temporary. The second feels permanent. Your soulmate suddenly remembered every moment they had ignored. Every time you tried to communicate. Every time you waited. Every time you gave them another chance. Every time you hid your disappointment. Every time you told yourself that maybe tomorrow would be different. And suddenly, memories that had once seemed insignificant became enormous. They remembered your patience. They remembered your voice. They remembered the way you looked at them when you still trusted them completely. They remembered the warmth that existed before fear entered the relationship. And they remembered the exact moment when they began taking your presence for granted. That memory hurt. Because they realized something too late. They had mistaken your patience for permanence. They thought because you forgave them before, you would always forgive them. They thought because you cared before, you would always care in exactly the same way. They thought because you stayed before, you could never leave emotionally. But you did not become heartless. You became wiser. And there is a difference. You did not stop caring. You simply stopped abandoning yourself to prove that you cared. That distinction was the real message. Your soulmate asked the psychic. Will they ever come back to me? The psychic did not answer immediately. Your soulmate stared at the screen. Then a message appeared. They may come back emotionally before they come back physically. That sentence confused them. What does that mean? The psychic explained. They are already returning in their heart. But they are not returning to the old version of the connection. Your soulmate felt something crack inside them. Because suddenly they understood. If they came back, they would have to meet the new you. Not the old you. Not the person who accepted uncertainty. Not the person who tolerated silence. Not the person who waited endlessly. They would have to meet someone who had learned boundaries. Someone who knew their value. Someone who could love deeply without begging to be chosen. And that was the person your soulmate had never prepared themselves to face. The psychic then said something even more unexpected. There is still an emotional thread between you, but it is changing. Your soulmate asked. Can it be restored? The psychic replied. Only if the person who broke the trust is willing to become honest about why they broke it. That was the moment your soulmate became completely silent. Because they knew exactly what that meant. They had never told you the whole truth. There were things they had hidden. Feelings they had buried. Fears they had disguised as indifference. Reasons they never explained. Words they wanted to say but were too proud to speak. And perhaps most importantly, there was a truth they had never admitted even to themselves. They were afraid of how deeply they loved you. Yes. That was the contradiction. They did not run because they felt nothing. They ran because feeling something real demanded vulnerability. And vulnerability terrified them. They had convinced themselves that distance would protect them. They thought if they kept control, they could avoid being hurt. So they created distance. They became inconsistent. They withdrew. They acted as though they were unaffected. They sometimes pretended that you mattered less than you actually did. And every time you felt confused, they told themselves that they were doing the right thing. But now they were sitting alone, asking a stranger to tell them whether you were happy. And the irony was unbearable. The person who had once tried so hard to hide their feelings was now paying someone to discover yours. The psychic continued. They are healing because they finally understood something. Your soulmate asked. What? The answer came slowly. They cannot force someone to choose them. Your soulmate closed their eyes. Because those words were exactly what they did not want to hear. You had stopped forcing. You had stopped chasing. You had stopped trying to convince anyone that your love deserved to be chosen. And that was why your energy had changed. The moment you stopped trying to control the outcome, something inside you became lighter. You began sleeping differently. Thinking differently. Looking at life differently. You started noticing small joys again. A peaceful morning. A song. A conversation. A simple laugh. A quiet moment when nobody was asking anything from you. And slowly, you realized that peace does not always arrive with an explanation. Sometimes peace arrives when you stop demanding that the past explain itself. That was your turning point. And your soulmate had no idea. They thought your silence meant sadness. But your silence was becoming peace. They thought your distance meant punishment. But your distance was becoming protection. They thought you were trying to make them jealous. But you were simply learning to live. They thought you had forgotten them. But you had not forgotten. You had simply stopped allowing the memory of them to control your future. That distinction destroyed them. The psychic asked your soulmate whether they wanted to know something deeper. They hesitated. Then said yes. The psychic told them. The person you are asking about has not become emotionally cold. They have become emotionally selective. Your soulmate swallowed hard. Selective. That word stayed in their mind. Because it meant the door was not necessarily locked. But neither was it wide open anymore. And that was far more frightening. An open door can be entered without effort. A closed door can be accepted as final. But a door that requires you to knock, explain yourself, and prove that you are no longer the person who caused the pain? That door demands courage. Your soulmate suddenly realized that if they wanted another chance, they would have to become honest. Not charming. Not dramatic. Not romantic. Honest. They would have to tell you what really happened inside them. They would have to admit what they were afraid of. They would have to acknowledge where they failed. They would have to stop protecting their ego at the expense of your heart. And for the first time, they wondered whether they were capable of doing that. The psychic's final message that night was short. They are happier now because they stopped waiting for you to give them permission to live. Your soulmate put the phone down. And then they cried. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. Because sometimes the deepest pain comes when you realize the person you loved was suffering while you were assuming they would always be there. They remembered how many times they had told themselves. They will understand. They will wait. They know I care. I just need time. But time had passed. And time had not frozen you. It had transformed you. Your soulmate sat alone with the unbearable realization that you were no longer standing at the same emotional location where they had left you. They had returned mentally to the old chapter. But you had already turned the page. And that was when something even stranger happened. The psychic sent one more message. Your soulmate almost ignored it. But something made them open it. The message said, "There is one thing about this connection that I have not told you." Your soulmate stared at those words. Their heart began racing. They asked, "What?" The psychic replied, "The reason your energy keeps pulling toward this person is not simply because you miss them." Your soulmate waited. Another message appeared. "It is because there is unfinished truth between you." Unfinished truth. Those words echoed through their mind. What truth? What had remained unsaid? What had been hidden? What had been misunderstood? Your soulmate suddenly thought about every conversation they had avoided. Every confession they swallowed. Every time they wanted to tell you something but changed the subject. Every moment they felt jealousy but pretended they did not care. Every night they checked your presence from a distance. Every time they typed your name into a search bar and then closed the screen. Every time they almost contacted you. Almost. But not quite. And then the psychic wrote something that made their hands go cold. The truth you are afraid to tell them may be the very truth that explains why you could never fully let them go. Your soulmate stared at the screen. They did not respond. For several minutes, they simply sat there. Because deep inside, they already knew what the psychic was talking about. There was a secret. Not a secret designed to hurt you. A secret born from fear. A truth connected to the moment they chose distance. A truth they had carried alone because they were convinced that telling you would change everything. And now, as they watched you becoming happy without them, they realized something terrifying. Keeping the truth hidden was no longer protecting the connection. It was destroying the last possibility of saving it. Your soulmate picked up their phone. They opened your conversation. They stared at your name. Their thumb hovered over the keyboard. They typed. "Can I tell you something?" They stopped. Deleted it. Typed again. "I know it's been a long time." Deleted. "I've been thinking about you." Deleted. "I need to explain." Deleted. Finally, they typed the sentence they had been afraid to write for so long. "I never stopped loving you." They stared at it. Their eyes filled with tears. But they still did not send it. Because something inside them whispered, "That is not enough." And that was the truth. "I love you" was not enough anymore. Not after everything. They needed to tell you why they left. Why they disappeared. Why they acted cold. Why they allowed you to believe that you were not important. Why they watched from a distance instead of standing beside you. Why they were afraid to return. And what had happened during the time they were gone. Because there was another piece of this story that the psychic had sensed. A piece your soulmate had never shared. A piece connected to the very beginning of your separation. A piece that could completely change how you understood everything. Your soulmate finally sent another message to the psychic. "Can you see what happened between us?" The psychic replied, "I can see the emotional pattern." "Then tell me." There was interference. Your soulmate froze. "From who?" The psychic did not answer immediately. Then came the words. "Someone who did not want this connection to become what it could have become." Your soulmate's face changed. Because suddenly, memories returned. A conversation. A warning. A person who had once told them something about you. A message they had received. A piece of information they believed at the time. A decision they made because they thought they were protecting themselves. But what if that information had not been true? What if the story they had believed about you had been incomplete? What if the reason they walked away was built on something someone else had told them? And what if you had spent all this time believing they left because they did not love you? Your soulmate looked at your name again. For the first time, they understood why the connection had always felt unfinished. There was something between you that had never been properly explained. Something buried underneath years of silence. Something that could not be healed with a simple apology. The psychic sent one final message. Before you contact them, you need to be prepared. Your soulmate asked. Prepared for what? The reply came. For the possibility that they may forgive you but still refuse to return to who they were. Your soulmate closed their eyes. That sentence was painful. But it was also honest. Because you had changed. And perhaps that was the greatest revelation of all. The purpose of your healing was never to make your soulmate regret losing you. It was to make you strong enough that whether they returned or not, you would still be okay. You had survived the silence. You had survived the unanswered questions. You had survived the nights when your heart wanted to reach backward while your life was trying to move forward. You had survived the version of yourself that thought closure could only come from another person's explanation. And now, whether you realized it or not, you were becoming free. That was why their heart was shaking. They were not simply afraid of losing you. They were afraid that the person they finally wanted to choose might no longer need to be chosen. They were afraid that their opportunity had passed. They were afraid that when they finally gathered the courage to tell the truth, you might already have found peace without it. And somewhere deep inside, your soulmate knew the truth. They could not demand another chance. They could only earn one. So they opened your conversation again. This time, they did not type, "I miss you." They did not type, "Come back." They did not send a romantic message. They began writing the truth. The truth about the warning. The truth about what they had heard. The truth about the person who influenced their decision. The truth about why they believed leaving you was necessary. The truth about the fear they had carried. The truth about how many times they almost came back. And the truth about what they discovered after you were gone. They typed for almost an hour. Then they stopped. Their message was long. Longer than anything they had ever sent you. They read it again. Their heart pounded. They knew that once they pressed send, there would be no hiding anymore. No more excuses. No more pretending. No more mysterious silence. No more watching you from a distance. They would finally have to stand in front of the truth. And then something unexpected happened. They noticed that you were online. Your soulmate stared at the screen. Their breathing changed. Their hand moved toward the send button. For months, they had imagined this moment. But now that it was actually happening, they were terrified. Because they suddenly understood something the psychic had never told them. You were not the only person who had been waiting for an answer. They had been waiting too. Waiting for courage. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for a sign that the door was not completely closed. And now the moment was here. Your soulmate looked at the message one last time. Their thumb hovered over the screen. Then they whispered your name. And just before they pressed send, another notification appeared. It was not from you. It was from the psychic. One sentence. One warning. One revelation that made your soulmate's entire body go still. The message said, "Do not send that confession yet." Your soulmate stared at the screen. Their heart dropped. Then another message arrived. There is something you still do not know about them. And this time, the psychic was not talking about your happiness. They were talking about the reason your happiness had changed so suddenly. Your soulmate's hands began trembling. "What don't I know?" they typed. The psychic started typing. Then stopped. Started again. Stopped again. Finally, 3 words appeared. You need to see. Your soulmate waited. The next message arrived. And when they read it, the confession they had spent an hour writing suddenly became irrelevant. Because the psychic had discovered something about your life that your soulmate never knew. Something connected to your healing. Something connected to the person you had become. Something that meant your happiness was not the end of your story. It was the beginning of something much bigger. And when your soulmate finally learned what that was, they realized they had been asking the wrong question all along. They had asked, "Are they happy without me?" But the real question was much more frightening. Are they still willing to let me be part of that happiness? And the answer was waiting in a message your soulmate had not yet opened. My beloved child. Your soulmate stared at the final message from the psychic, unable to move. There is something you still do not know about them. Their heart was racing. What is it? They typed. This time, the psychic answered quickly. They are happy because they finally stopped believing that your return was the only thing that could complete their life. Your soulmate lowered the phone. Those words hurt more than they expected. Because they finally understood. You had not become happy to make them jealous. You had not healed to punish them. You had simply reached a place where your life no longer depended on whether they came back. And that realization broke the last illusion they had been holding on to. They had spent so much time believing that if they returned one day, you would immediately run toward them. But the psychic had sensed something different. You still have feelings, the message said, but your feelings are no longer controlling your decisions. Your soulmate closed their eyes. That was the answer that destroyed them. You still cared. But you had learned to care without chasing. You still remembered. But you had learned to remember without waiting. You still loved parts of what you once shared. But you had learned that love alone cannot repair what honesty, consistency, and courage are required to repair. Your soulmate looked at the long confession they had written. For a moment, they considered deleting everything. Then they remembered why they had contacted the psychic in the first place. They wanted to know whether you were happy. Now they knew. And strangely, knowing that you were happy did not make them hate you. It made them respect you. It made them realize how strong you had become. And for the first time, they stopped asking, "How can I get them back?" Instead, they asked, "What would I have to become to deserve another chance?" That question changed everything. They opened the message again. They removed every dramatic sentence. They removed every attempt to make you feel guilty. They removed every excuse. And they left only the truth. I hurt you. I was afraid. I listened to things I should have questioned. I walked away when I should have communicated. I thought time would keep the door open. I was wrong. Then they wrote the sentence that required the most courage. I don't expect you to come back. I only want you to finally know the truth. They stared at it. Their finger hovered over send. Then they pressed it. Sent. For the first time in a long time, your soulmate felt completely exposed. There was nothing left to hide behind. No pride. No distance. No excuses. Just truth. They placed the phone beside them and waited. 1 minute. 5 minutes. 10. There was no response. And this time, they did not send another message. They waited. Because they were finally learning the lesson they should have learned long ago. Love is not pressure. Love is not possession. Love is not demanding an immediate answer. Sometimes love means telling the truth and allowing the other person the freedom to decide what happens next. Meanwhile, you saw the message. You read it once. Then again. Your heart became strangely quiet. You had imagined receiving an explanation so many times. You had imagined anger. You had imagined tears. You had imagined running back. But when the moment finally came, you discovered something unexpected. You were not the same person who had once desperately needed that explanation. You did not feel destroyed. You felt peaceful. You understood. You saw the fear behind their actions. You saw the mistakes. You saw the manipulation of circumstances. You saw the things they had misunderstood. But understanding someone did not mean you had to forget what happened. So you closed your eyes and whispered, "God, if this person is truly meant to return, let them return differently." That was the prayer that changed the direction of everything. Not bring them back. Not make them love me. Not make them regret losing me. You asked for truth. And truth was exactly what began unfolding. Your soulmate, still waiting for your response, received a message from the psychic. You have received your answer. They asked. What answer? The psychic replied. They are happy. Your soulmate stared at those words. Then another message appeared. And that happiness does not exclude you. They froze. The psychic continued. But if you return, you cannot ask them to become who they were. Your soulmate understood. They would have to meet you where you were now. With honesty. With consistency. With patience. With actions. Not promises. Not emotional speeches. Actions. And that was the final lesson. Sometimes heaven does not remove a person from your life because the connection was meaningless. Sometimes the separation exposes everything that could never have been healed while two people were pretending. Your separation had forced you both to grow. You learned self-worth. They learned accountability. You learned how to live without chasing. They learned that love cannot be postponed forever. You learned peace. They learned the cost of losing it. And now the future was no longer about whether your soulmate could return. It was about whether both of you could create something healthier than what existed before. Your phone suddenly vibrated. A new message. It was from your soulmate. Only 5 words. I'll wait for your answer. You looked at the screen. And for the first time, you smiled. Not because you were certain they would return. Not because everything was suddenly fixed. But because you finally understood your own power. You did not have to chase. You did not have to convince. You did not have to beg. You did not have to prove your worth. You could simply choose. And somewhere beyond what human eyes could see, the old chapter was finally closing. Not with revenge. Not with bitterness. But with truth. Your soulmate had hired a psychic to discover whether you were happy without them. They expected heartbreak. They expected loneliness. They expected to hear that you were still waiting. Instead, they received something far more powerful. They discovered that you had survived. You had healed. You had grown. And somehow, after everything, your heart had remained capable of love without remaining trapped in the past. That was what destroyed them. But it was also what awakened them. Because sometimes the greatest miracle is not getting someone back. Sometimes the miracle is becoming strong enough to know that if they return, you can choose them freely, and if they don't, you can still walk forward peacefully. So, beloved child, remember this fictional message as a reminder. Never measure your worth by someone's absence. Never believe that someone else's inability to love you correctly means you were unworthy of love. And never confuse waiting with destiny. If someone is meant to return, let them return with truth. Let them return with changed behavior. Let them return with a heart that understands the value of what it once took for granted. And if they do not return, do not believe your story has ended. Your life is bigger than one person's decision. Your peace is bigger than one person's absence. Your future is bigger than your past. And the person who once wondered whether you were happy without them may eventually realize the most painful truth of all. You were never waiting for them to save you. You were waiting to discover that you could save yourself. And now you have. The screen went dark. Your soulmates sat quietly in the same room, holding the phone. For the first time, they did not feel abandoned. They felt humbled. Because they finally understood why losing you had hurt so much. It was not simply because they had lost someone they loved. It was because they had lost the version of themselves that existed when you believed in them. And now, if they wanted another chance, they would have to become worthy of that belief again. Not through words. Through time. Through truth. Through actions. And whether your paths eventually crossed again or remained separate, one thing had already changed forever. They finally knew you were happy. And you finally knew that your happiness did not need anyone's permission. That was the real answer. That was the real miracle. And that was the moment your story stopped being about who left. And became about who you were becoming. Your soulmate had searched for an answer. They found one. But in finding it, they discovered something they had never expected. They had not truly lost you when you walked away. They lost you the moment they believed you would never learn how to live without them. And you did. You learned. You healed. You rose. And now, whatever happens next, you are no longer the person they left behind. You are the person who finally chose yourself. And sometimes, beloved child, that is where the most beautiful chapter begins.